Nahum. I mean, if there's ever a fire and brimstone prophet in the Old Testament, it is this guy. He definitely has a lot of difficult things to say to Nineveh. Let's start in with verse 1. The oracle concerning Nineveh, the scroll of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. Nahum seems to have this like double opening. The oracle concerning Nineveh, which would be a satisfactory opening, although it doesn't tell us about Nahum, but it kind of opens the theme of the book. But then it follows that with the scroll of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. And some commentators have pointed out these two words, oracle and vision, and suggest that Nahum actually falls into two parts. One part that is primarily this oracle, which is just declaring straightforwardly the judgment against Nineveh, and then the vision, which is describing in visual detail what that destruction would look like, using sights, sounds, descriptions of the actual fall of Nineveh as a visionary experience, something that the prophet saw in his mind's eye at least. So I think that's a valid description after having looked through it, and so I'm going to use those two words to describe two broad divisions in the book of Nahum. Nahum is, of course, the author or preacher of this prophetic book from the city of Elkosh. Have absolutely no idea where Elkosh is. I looked at a couple of different commentaries on this. Elkosh has been tentatively identified with cities way in the north, even one of them that's outside of Israelite proper territory, to places in the south, very near Jerusalem. So it's anybody's guess where Elkosh is, but Nahum is from there. Nahum's name is just the root word of comfort, which is rather ironic when you consider what Nahum has to say is hardly comforting, at least not for Nineveh. But actually, I don't think Nineveh is the audience of Nahum's prophecy, because how likely is it that some Israelite prophet is going to get heard in Nineveh? Now, except for Jonah, who actually went there and spoke to them directly, we don't have any record of when this was preached or exactly to whom. But given the context, most scholars believe this message was actually for the southern tribes of Israel, who were at the time getting threatened from Assyria, and at the time Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. So what comfort there is from Nahum, the man of comfort, ironically, is for Israel, or Judah specifically, that the Assyrians are not going to win in the end, that Judah and Israel as a whole will escape the Assyrian threat. When did Nahum preach? We think, or I say we, the commentaries I've read, scholarly input puts me at thinking that it was during the reign of the southern king Manasseh, which would make it approximately 650 BC. Now, why would Nahum have been prompted to preach this message? What was the occasion? Well, we know that after Assyria successfully conquered the north, they didn't just stop. Assyria, like all the conquering nations of that era, wanted more territory. And so they actually had aggression against areas all around Israel, and I mean Judah. After they defeated Israel, they continued to make inroads against places as far south as Egypt. And that would have put a threat on Judah's ongoing existence as well. And so scholars believe that Assyria had a spike in their aggression in nearby areas, and this might have prompted Nahum by God to speak out and give hope to the people of Judah that Assyria was not going to be destroying them as as Assyria had destroyed the northern tribes in the kingdom of Israel. So looking at the time frames, this is Jonah. And so we know that Jonah and Amos both preached sometime during the reign of Jeroboam, the northern king, Jeroboam. So that would have put Jonah somewhere around 780 BC. And this is the time frame for Nahum, around 650 BC. So 130 odd years after Jonah. So at least 3 generations later than the book of Jonah, or rather from the prophet Jonah. I'm not sure when Jonah the book was written, but Jonah the prophet preaching to Nineveh happened more than 100 years before Nahum preached. So there's quite a bit of difference between them. And that's why we can see that the whole generation that came up during the time of Jonah and who repented of their aggression and who had turned to God, that had passed away. And there was a whole new generation, at least 2 generations later, that was the target of Nahum's prophecy. Now, why can we date Nahum as precisely as this when Nahum doesn't tell us exactly when? Well, Nahum actually refers to the fall of the Egyptian city of Thebes, which is very handy. You don't usually get these time markers so well. And we know when Thebes fell because it's documented in other ancient writings that we can date according to the chronology of the ancient world. So we know that Thebes fell around 663 BC. And whenever Nahum is preaching, it was after that, because Nahum uses that as a historical marker to compare Nineveh to. So it was after 663 BC. And we know that Nineveh is still standing and is still the capital of Assyria when Nahum is preaching, because he refers to its destruction as a future event. Well, Nineveh fell in 612 BC to the Babylonians. So we can see that sometime within this roughly 50-year period of 663 BC to 612 BC is when Nahum preached. Now, the third marker that we can use is Manasseh. Manasseh revolted against Assyria, as we have recorded in the book of 2 Kings, sometime around 652 BC. One hypothesis that I think is a valid hypothesis, at least, maybe unprovable, is that Manasseh's revolt against Assyria was partly because he was emboldened by the message of Nahum that Assyria was not going to be a permanent oppressor, that Assyria was going to fall. And so the theory is that Nahum preached this message of Assyria's destruction, and then Manasseh was emboldened by that message to revolt against Assyria. That's all hypothetical, because Nahum is not mentioned by Manasseh. There's no particular motivation given except for trying to throw off an oppressive nation. That, because Judah, even though Judah existed, it was still paying tribute to Assyria. Assyria, it was basically a client state. It paid to Assyria in order to have the privilege of staying in its own identity. So Manasseh revolted against Assyria to try to throw off that tribute that they were having to pay to Assyria for the privilege of staying a semi-independent state. And the theory is that Nahum's message may have encouraged that rebellion. We don't know. But if you have to pick a time in between 663 and 612, that seems like a reasonable hypothesis to put forward. So that's what I'm going with. Now, what about the message itself? In verses 2 through 10, first section of chapter 1, Yahweh is described as jealous and avenging, patient, but powerful. His presence is awesome. We have another section where he marches on the storm clouds, dries up the rivers, shakes the mountains. But we don't have just negative words or words of God's destruction, because he's also described as a refuge for faithful to him that will consume the enemies and consume them like chaff, while protecting his people, the people who are faithful to him. Now, the last part of chapter 1 does turn focus to Nineveh. Yahweh will specifically defeat Nineveh and free Judah from oppression. Nahum uses some wording that echoes Isaiah in that, and so we'll look at that piece in more detail. And he personifies the wicked power of Nineveh using the name Belial. It's another thing we're going to look at. Moving on, I believe the vision section of Nahum starts with the last verse of chapter 1, verse 15, and then goes through the rest of chapter 2. Now, I think the whole rest of the book is the vision, but the vision sort of starts with verse 15, where a messenger comes to Judah declaring the defeat of Nineveh and promising that Yahweh will restore the majesty of Israel. This is part of a vision because it describes seeing the messenger coming, or it uses the Isaiah language here. Blessed is the one on the mountains who brings good news. Well, nobody during Nahum's own time is bringing that good news about the destruction of Nineveh. So it must be the vision of a messenger in the future coming with this good news to Israel about Nineveh's defeat. Then Nahum describes Nineveh's destruction and military defeat with vivid colors and descriptions. Red shields, gleaming chariots, the people being in a panic, running around as their city is plundered. Nahum gives some great imagery and poetic descriptions here. So finishing off chapter 2, then Nineveh is compared to a lion's den. The den was once home to a powerful pride of lions who were conquering all that they could control. They were the power in the neighborhood, but the lions are going to be destroyed. And then it describes the lion's den as just a cave full of carcasses. The lions will just no longer be a threat because they'll be dead in this cave. And whereas this section begins with a messenger coming and declaring the defeat of Nineveh to Israel, the end of this says that the messengers of Nineveh are silent, because nobody's bringing good news to Nineveh. Nobody's bringing messengers to them because they are dead in the picture that Nahum is giving. The vision continues through chapter 3. Nineveh is going to fall. Nahum gives 3 succinct reasons for the fall here. She has shed much blood, she is a deceiver, and she has hoarded the spoils of war. So the implication is that she's made herself a target by keeping all of the wealth in that one spot. It becomes a tempting target for anybody to come after because they've got all the wealth right there. And then morally, she deserves destruction because she has shed the blood and has been a deceiving nation. In very terse language in this section, Nahum describes the sounds and sights of battle. Then in verses 4 through 7, because Nineveh has been a prostitute with the other nations, Yahweh is going to strip her naked for the nations to see her shame and filth. She'll find no sympathy among the nations, only scorn. In verses 8 through 11, that's where we get this description of Thebes, the Egyptian city, which was a stronghold, a fortified city of Egypt, a very strong defensive city in Egypt. And Thebes had been destroyed by, guess who? The Assyrians. So the Assyrians destroyed Thebes, and now Nahum is saying that they're going to get as bad as they gave. They destroyed Thebes, well, they're going to be destroyed themselves. And then Nahum ends with Nineveh's defenses being described as just ripe fruit. Like, your wall is made of overripe figs, and they're just going to be nothing against an enemy onslaught. The commanders are going to flee like locusts. I thought that was an interesting twist on the locust theme, because locusts are usually pictured as invading destroyers. We saw that in Joel, we saw it in Amos. The locust is a picture of a destroyer, but locusts also fly away. They're not reliable. And what Nahum says here is that the commanders of the defenders of Nineveh are going to be like locusts on a hot day. They're just going to fly off, and they're not going to defend the city. And the people are going to scatter like sheep on the hills. Nations are going to rejoice at Nineveh's defeat, because Assyria has been cruel to them all. So Syria has, this one she's described as a deceiver, and why she's going to find no sympathy, because Assyria has dealt badly with all the other nations that she's come in contact with. So because Assyria has been unfaithful, essentially, to any of her commitments, she's going to find no sympathy when she is herself the victim of an attack, and instead is going to fall. So one thing that sets Nahum apart from some of the other prophets is that almost every other prophet ends with some note of hope. Usually it's hope for Israel, of course, but Nahum doesn't end that way. He just ends right here with the destruction of Nineveh. The only notes of hope that we find in Nahum are back in chapters 1 and 2, where God is a avenger of Israel and defends those who are faithful to him. But he doesn't end his prophecy on that note. He ends it right there with Assyria just finding nobody who will comfort her in her time of need. But that's Assyria's own fault. All right, drilling down in some of the details, Nahum chapter 1, verse 2 just brings out, this is why I say Nahum is the fire and brimstone prophet of the Old Testament. He starts off with just these difficult words. Yahweh is a jealous God and avenging. Yahweh is avenging and full of wrath. Yahweh takes vengeance against his enemies. He rages against his adversaries. And these descriptions, jealous, avenging, full of wrath, he rages against enemies. I'm not going to hear a lot of sermons that focus on these qualities of God. People, humans, are advised not to have these qualities. Proverbs has definite criticism against people who are full of wrath, that they are just self-destructive. And we are told not to rage. That is also the verb there for he rages against adversaries is also the word for having a grudge. And we are told in Scripture not to hold grudges, not to feel that way. And so just about every one of these descriptions of God is something humans should avoid. But God is celebrated for having them. He is righteous. Mm-hmm. His wrath is never vindictive for petty reasons. His wrath is poured out for legitimate reasons, for injustice, for violations of godly character. And he knows how to mete out wrath appropriately. So he is the only one who should exhibit these qualities. Here is the one nice verse, in Nahum. We had that needlepoint verse from Amos about justice rolling down like a stream and righteousness. And here we have the needlepoint verse of Nahum. Yahweh is good. a refuge in the day of distress. He knows those who take refuge in him. There is the note of hope. The one note of hope in Nahum is that God knows those who take refuge in him, and he will be their refuge. And he is good, and that good is why he can be wrathful and still be righteous, because he is a good God. Chapter 1, verse 11, from you goes out one who plots evil against Yahweh, one who plans wickedness. Who is the one who plans wickedness? I wanted to try to know more about that. Is that supposed to be the king of Assyria? Or who? Well, I found out a couple of interesting things. The one who plans wickedness, that phrase isn't the literal Hebrew. It's an interpretive phrase given by translators. It literally says, from you goes out one who plots evil against Yahweh, a counselor of Belial. Belial is a proper name, like Yahweh is a proper name, but it sometimes gets translated as Lord God, because the translators deal with that name differently. Well, Belial is a proper name that gets translated sometimes as wickedness, or maybe sometimes as a worthless one, but it gets translated as something other than a proper name. But it is a proper name, Belial. And this entity seems to be more than a human. It seems to be like a demonic power that is at work. And who is going out is not Belial per se, but the counselor of Belial. The word one who plans, that phrase one who plans, is used in most cases in the Old Testament as the name of a position, a role of counselor, a counselor to a king normally. But this word is just a regular noun for a counselor. So it is somebody who is a counselor of Belial. And I think that what is meant here from Nahum is that, like Isaiah might have been called a counselor of Yahweh to Hezekiah, because Isaiah was a counselor giving advice to Hezekiah and giving him a spiritual perspective on things. But he was representing Yahweh to Hezekiah. He gave the words of Yahweh to him as his advisor or counselor. Well, I think that what Nahum is suggesting is that the counselor to the king of Assyria is a counselor of Belial, this demonic power. He's giving demonic advice to the king of Assyria, and that is having influence in all of the area that Assyria controls. This from you goes out one who plots evil. Going out is used in other contexts to mean, influencing a lot wider sphere. It starts in one spot and then it influences the area around it. And so what I think is that Nahum is suggesting that Nineveh is being controlled by a man who listens to the counsel of Belial or wickedness. It's definitely demonic and adversary to Yahweh. And so that is what we have. Nahum is condemning Assyria through Nineveh, the capital, of being an instrument of this demonic embodiment. It's not the only time that name is used in Nahum. It comes up again. Before we get to that, though, we have this section, this last verse of chapter 1, verse 15. This is where he sounds like Isaiah. Look, on the mountains, the feet of the one who brings good tidings, the one who proclaims peace. Celebrate your festivals, O Judah, fulfill your vows, for he will not invade you again. The wicked one is cut off completely. So this is the affirmation, the start of the vision, that we see this one on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good tidings, the one who proclaims peace. In the context, it's clear that the good tidings are the destruction of Nineveh and the peace that would come after this oppressing nation is defeated. And Judah will have the freedom again then to celebrate their own festivals and not be under the thumb of the Assyrian nation. This is Isaiah. I just wanted to point out the similarities between Isaiah and Nahum here. Isaiah's wording is, how delightful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns as king. Break forth, sing for joy together, ruins of Jerusalem, for Yahweh has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. Just an interesting note that he uses this phrase about bringing good news and announcing peace. And basically the message, your God reigns as king, is like saying that the oppressing nation is no longer going to have authority over you. Only God will. Yahweh will be the king. But also he says that Yahweh has comforted his people. Comforted is a variation on the term Nahum. It is Nahum's name. So it's just interesting that the word Nahum for comforted comes up in this context where Nahum seems to be quoting Isaiah in his message. Oh, and this is where Belial comes up again. That wicked one in the second part, you might have suspected, and it is, in fact, the word Belial. He will not invade you again. Belial is cut off completely. So the idea here, I think, is that the defeat of Nineveh is not merely the defeat of a physical location, but the defeat of a spiritual influence. The defeat of this Belial, this demonic influence that is pulling people down. When God works in the physical realm by destroying the city, he is also working in the spiritual realm and undermining the influence and power of this demonic force. This Belial is going to be defeated before Yahweh. Well, it turns out Belial is mentioned in the New Testament by name. And that's in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 and 15. Do not become unevenly yoked with unbelievers, for what participation is there between righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship does light have with darkness? Or what agreement does Christ have with Beliar? Or what share does a believer have with an unbeliever? Here we have a variation on Belial. The L and the R at the end of the name are actually confused in a lot of literature. Belial, Beliar, they're by studying the literature of the writings in and outside of Scripture, it's clear that Beliar and Belial are the same entity. And so we have Paul here referencing this entity and comparing Christ to Beliar, and saying they're just totally antithetical to one another. Christ, of course, Jesus, is the ultimate obedient one to God. He was obedient unto death. And so Christ is elevated here as that righteous one, and Beliar as an antagonist, and lawlessness and unbelief. And on that side of the equation is also Beliar / Belial, the wickedness, the unfaithful one. But the point of Nahum is that these satanic forces don't hold a candle against Yahweh. They will be destroyed. They and the people who side with them, like the Ninevites apparently, are listening. They're listening to the counsel of Belial. They're listening to this demonic influence, and because they are doing that, they are going to suffer God's wrath. So the victims of God's wrath are the people who are rebelling against Yahweh and choosing to listen to these demonic spiritual beings. Satan, Belial, or whatever, however you want to call them, if they're opposed to Yahweh, they are under God's wrath, and so are the people who follow them. And the thing about Nineveh, and maybe why we have Nahum, is that the people of Nineveh could have remained loyal to Yahweh as the generation was under Jonah. In Jonah's day, when he gave his message, the people of Nineveh repented of their devotion to Belial or any of these false gods. And the people of Nineveh in that day were faithful to Yahweh for however long, for one generation, for two, but they turned back to the demonic influences. They turned back away from Yahweh to these influences of evil. And that rebellion has got them slated for God's wrath. They will be destroyed, which is how Nahum ends. I just will have to quickly step through chapter 3. I just encourage you to read it. And there's the decrying the prostitution. I wanted to point out this similarity. The idea of a city being embodied or personified as a prostitute comes across in the book of Revelation, where the great whore sitting on the beast is described in that same kind of way. So Nineveh was that in the days of Nahum. Rome would be that in the days of John the Revelator. But whatever city is rebelling against God is described in these ways. This is the last bit of Nahum where I just want to read this. The shepherds are sleeping, king of Assyria. Your nobles slumber. Your people are scattered on the mountains. No one can gather them. There is no healing for your wound. Your injury is fatal. All who hear the report of you will clap their hands for joy concerning you, for who has not suffered at the hands of your endless cruelty? That's the last words of Nahum to Assyria, which basically is like, this is all your own fault because you have been so mean and faithless to everybody around you. And Nahum would and did ascribe that kind of faithlessness to the influences of evil that are affecting Nineveh, because the influences of the opponents of Yahweh are always faithlessness, because they have themselves been faithless. God entrusted them to lead the nations with justice and righteousness and to reflect his own character amongst the nations. And instead, they have rebelled and are leading the nations down a false path into idolatry and into faithless acts. And so when the person you're listening to is faithless, you're going to reflect that same character in you. I guess that's one reason why the Bible says that bad company corrupts good morals, because if whoever you're listening to for wise counsel, they're going to influence your behavior. And if that behavior is wrong, it will lead you to suffering God's wrath.